Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 91. With our book today, a meditation on practical politics from a former president from the early 20th century. The leader of the Bull Moose Party and a progressive Republican who charged at San Juan Hill. A man who would describe himself as being self-made, and yet a man who came from what was considered one of the richest families in the early 20th century. Essays from a man who busted trusts and placed himself against what we would call the gilded billionaires of his time. We are going to be reading today a couple of essays on practical politics by state legislature turned president Theodore Roosevelt. Leaders have a vision of the future at the end of the year rather than continuing to flagellate and navel-gaze in abstractions about sins and transgressions of the past. And when you do that, realize that the new man you're seeking to create is still going to be bound by the exigencies of human nature. And so we're going to pick up today in Essays on Practical Politics by Theodore Roosevelt, written during the time when he was in the New York State Assembly, a representative from the 21st District. He began as a minority leader on January 1st, 1883. And then he continued his service in government by moving on to the United States Civil Service Commission, and then later to presidency of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. But Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, T.R. Roosevelt, was a member of the New York State Assembly starting in January 1st, 1882 through December 31st of 1884. And he ascended, as I said there previously, to being minority leader in January of 1883. So these essays, which I got as a reprint from the collection of the University of Michigan Library via Google Books, so this is open source, you can go check this out, were written during his time in the state legislature and were published as part of Teddy Roosevelt's attempt to get people to understand how legislation, how parliamentary procedure, and how government actually works. So, picking up from the introduction from Teddy Roosevelt's Essays on Practical Politics. These two essays appeared originally in The Century. Both alike were criticized at the time as offering no cure for the evils they portrayed. Such a criticism shows, in the first place, a curious ignorance of what is meant by the diagnosis of a disease. For my articles pretended to do nothing more than give what has apparently never before been given, an accurate account of certain phases of our political life with its good and bad impartially set forth. The practical politician, who alone knows how our politics are really managed, is rarely willing to write about them, unless with very large reservations, while the student reformer, whose political experience is limited to the dinner table, the debating club, or an occasional mass meeting where none but his friends are present, and who yet seeks in pamphlet or editorial column to make clear the subject, hardly ever knows exactly what he is talking about and abuses the system in all its parts with such looseness of language as to wholly take away the value even from such of his utterances as are true. In the second place, such criticism shows in the mind of the critic the tendency, so common among imperfectly educated people, to clamor for cure-all or quack remedies. The same habit of thought that makes a man in one class of life demand a medicine that will ease all of his complaints offhand makes another man, who probably considers himself very much higher in the social scale, expect some scheme of reform that will, at a single fell swoop, do away with every evil from which the body politic is suffering. Each of these men is willing enough to laugh at the other, and after all, their inconsistency is no greater than is that of the editor who in one column denounces governmental interference with the hours of labor, and in the next calls for governmental interference with the party primaries, or vice versa, apparently not seeing that both are identical in kind, and being perhaps necessary deviations from the old American principle that the state must not interfere with individual action, even to help the weak. There are many reforms, each of which, if accomplished, would do us much good, but for permanent improvement, we must rely upon bettering our general health, upon raising the tone of our political system. Thus, the enactment and enforcement of laws making the merit system, as contrasted with the spoils system, universally applicable among all minor officials of county, state, and nation, would measurably improve our public service, and would be of immeasurable benefit to all honest men, rich or poor, who desire to do their duty in public affairs without being opposed to bands of trained mercenaries. The regulation of the liquor traffic, so as to expose it to strict supervision and to minimize its attendant evils, would likewise do immense good. But even if the power of the saloons was broken, and public office no longer a reward for partisan service, many and great evils would remain to be battled with. No law or laws can give us good government. At the utmost, they can only give us the opportunity to ourselves to get good government. For instance, until the control of the aldermen over the mayor's appointments was taken away by bill, which I always esteemed it my chief legislative service to have introduced and been instrumental in passing, New York City politics were hopeless. Now it rests with the citizens themselves to elect a man who will serve them wisely and faithfully. So this year on the podcast, or this season on the podcast, I guess, we're going to continue the efforts that I talked about in our New Year's Day post, where we sort of laid out the foundation for where we're going to be going here in 2024. And of course, it is an election year in the United States of America. We have the Republican primary occurring right now as I'm recording this podcast episode today, and it's been going on for quite some time. We have a Democrat primary, ostensibly, that is also running, although everyone knows that the current president is probably going to be the nominee, barring ill health or death. And so there's really no surprises right now in America around our presidential politics. The only real surprise in 2024 is what is the battleground upon which the election will be fought. What is going to be, to use a military terminology, what's going to be the Gettysburg? What's going to be the Verdun? What's going to be the Mogadishu that the various parties and their supporters and factions, or the two parties and their supporters and factions, will line up on? A lot of that battleground is occurring or is being laid out and has been for the last 4 years since the last election, has been laid out on social media, on places like Facebook and TikTok and YouTube and Twitter. Social media platforms have become the new battlegrounds, but also the old battlegrounds are still there, and these are battlegrounds around ideas. Now, I'm a big fan of ideas, as you know, if you listen to this podcast for any length of time. And so we're going to explore an idea in this episode. We're going to use Theodore Roosevelt's ideas that he wrote as a young assemblyman as an anchor for where we can go to think about this idea. And of course, this year we are exploring solutions to problems, not merely chewing over old problems repeatedly and then not offering any solutions. So, well, Roosevelt offers some solutions, and that's helpful because we need to think about solutions in an election year to some of the more damning and damaging problems that we have currently in the body politic. Roosevelt opens Essays on Practical Politics with the introduction that I read by going back to an age-old question, which we explored in episode number 90 with Tom Libby. I would encourage you to go listen to that episode, the one we kicked off this year with, on the Republic by Plato. And he begins with this idea, which has haunted American politics for decades, probably going all the way back to the founding, honestly. And it is this idea of what kind of guardians do we want to rule over us? What kind of people do we want to have in charge? Do we want to have people who are moral? Do we want to have people who are ethical? Or do we want to have people who are progressive in their political thinking, but who are maybe a bit more conservative in their social thinking? Or do we want to have alignment in our guardians? Do we want to have alignment between their personal lives and their professional pursuits? Or do we all want to be deceived? This is a key question. Do we want to be deceived? Do we want to have alignment? Do we want to have a mismatch? And each voter answers this question differently for themselves, inside of themselves. And then the mass of voters, not necessarily always the majority, and then our society pushes through culture, through social norming, through the body politic, pushes our elected leaders and actually raises up our elected leaders from the lowest possible level to the highest possible level, and encourages them to become, well, whatever it is we want them to become. And Roosevelt's going to talk about the difference between leaders from cities versus leaders from the country. And that difference, even though it existed in 1883, when he writes about it, you can still hear the difference today. The only maybe real change there is that the person from the country and the person from the city are now both on Instagram. Legislatures are made up of people, and people in any society are fundamentally flawed. The fundamental catch in human nature is that we are full of sin. We are full of sin from beyond the cradle, and sometimes some of us don't get a hold of it, and we take it with us beyond the grave. And no amount of utopian manipulation is going to change that. That is beyond the ken of politics. But in the 1960s and 1970s in this country, the baby boomer generation began a mantra. They began stating the idea, or at least began really buying into the idea at a mass level, that we could create this new man. We could create this new human being through the vagaries of technology. This human being that would not be flawed, and that if at minimum we couldn't create a human being, at the very minimum we could create new politics, and the politics would lead us to a new world order. Just like most utopian schemes, that didn't happen. And now we're left with the same old problems, searching for ancient solutions. Back to the book, back to Essays on Practical Politics. So we're going to pick up here in his first essay that Theodore Roosevelt wrote, once again, for, as he mentions in the introduction, for Century magazine. This is on the phases of state legislation in the Albany legislature. So for those of you who are unaware, Albany is the capital of the state of New York, not New York City, as much as you may think it should be. And when you shuffle off to Albany from New York City or from anywhere else in New York State, even back in 1883, you were going someplace that had a lot of political clout. We don't think of New York State as having political clout these days. As a matter of fact, a lot of our thinking around that has moved to places like Texas or California or Florida because of population shifts. But back in the early part of the 20th century and the late part of the 19th century, New York State was the state to go to. New York State was the state to be in. As a matter of fact, New York State was a very strong Republican state. New York City has always leaned Democrat. It has become more Democrat and more progressive over the course of time. But in the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, New York State itself was, in the modern conception of electoral politics in America, a red state. As a matter of fact, most of the country was a red country. Now, with that being said, Roosevelt, and not just Teddy Roosevelt, but also his cousin who would come along later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, were considered to be relatively moderate to liberal Republicans during their time. Now, that means something different than what it means now, and they were governing and they were leading from a sense of Victorian aristocracy, which, again, we don't have a whole lot of examples of that in our modern society, in our modern culture. And so when Roosevelt writes about the phases of legislation, he is going to start with this core idea, which comes out of Victorian mindset, this core idea of character. So we're going to pick up from his Essays on Practical Politics with the character of the representatives. The representatives from different sections of the state differ widely in character. Those from the country districts are generally very good men. They are usually well-to-do farmers, small lawyers, or prosperous storekeepers, and are shrewd, quiet, and honest. They are often narrow-minded and slow to receive an idea, but on the other hand, when they get a good one, they cling to it with the utmost tenacity. They form very much the most valuable class of legislators. For the most part, they are Native Americans, and those who are not are men who have become completely Americanized in all their ways and habits of thought. One of the most useful members of the last legislature was a German from a western county, and the extent of his Americanization can be judged from the fact that he was actually an ardent prohibitionist. Certainly no one who knows Teutonic human nature will require further proof. Again, I sat for an entire session beside a very intelligent member from northern New York before I discovered that he was an Irishman. All his views of legislation, even upon such subjects as free schools and the improved propriety of making appropriations from the Treasury for the support of sectarian institutions, were precisely similar to those of his Protestant American neighbors, though he himself was a Catholic. Now, a German or an Irishman from one of the great cities would have retained most of his national peculiarities. It is from these same great cities that the worst legislators come. It is true that there are always among them a few cultivated and scholarly men who are well educated and who stand on a higher and broader intellectual and moral plane than the county members, but the bulk are very low indeed. They are usually foreigners of little or no education, with exceedingly misty ideas as to morality, and possessed of an ignorance so profound that it could only be called comic, were it not for the fact that it has at times such serious effects upon our laws. It is their ignorance, quite as much as actual viciousness, which makes it so difficult to procure the passage of good laws or prevent the passage of bad ones. And it is the most irritating of the many elements with which we have to contend in the fight for good government. Mention has been made above of the bribe taking, which undoubtedly at times occurs in the New York legislature. This is what is commonly called a delicate subject with which to deal, and therefore, according to our usual methods of handling delicate subjects, it is either never discussed at all or else discussed with the grossest exaggeration. But most certainly there is nothing about it which is more important to know, about which it is more important to know the truth. In each of the last three legislatures, there were a number of us who were interested in getting through certain measures which we deemed to be for the public good, but which were certain to be strongly opposed, some for political and some for pecuniary reasons. Now, to get through any such measure requires genuine hard work, a certain amount of parliamentary skill, a good deal of tact and courage, and above all, a thorough knowledge of the men with whom one has to deal, and of the motives which actuate them. In other words, before taking any active steps, we had to size up our fellow legislators to find out their past history and present character and associates, to find out whether they were their own masters or were acting under the direction of someone else, whether they were bright or stupid, etc., etc. As a result, and after very careful study, conducted purely with the object of learning the truth so that we might work more effectually, we came to the conclusion that about a third of the members were open to corrupt influences in some form or other. In certain sessions, the proportion was greater, and in some less. Now, it would, of course, be impossible for me or anyone else to prove in a court of law that these men were guilty, except perhaps in 2 or 3 cases. Yet we felt absolutely confident that there was hardly a case in which our judgment as to the honesty of any given member was not correct. The 2 or 3 exceptional cases alluded to, where legal proof of guilt might have been forthcoming, were instances in which honest men were approached by their colleagues at times when the need for votes was very great. But even then, it would have been almost impossible to punish the offenders before a court, for it would have merely resulted in his denying what his accuser stated. Moreover, the members who had been approached would have been very reluctant to come forward, for each of them felt ashamed that his character should not have been well enough known to prevent anyone's daring to speak to him on such a subject. And another reason why the few honest men who are approached, for the lobbyist rarely makes a mistake in his estimate of the men who will be apt to take bribes, do not feel like taking action in the matter is that a doubtful lawsuit will certainly follow, which will drag on so long that the public will come to regard all of the participants with equal distrust, while in the end the decision is quite as likely to be against them as to be for them. All right, so what are we to take from that? Well, I think the biggest thing we could take from that is that character counts, right? Men from the city, men from the country. And he talks a lot in that piece there about people of certain national origin, right? And he talks about Americanization. Back in the late 19th century, just as in our own time, immigration was going on, but not immigration from Mexico to America. No. It was immigration from Eastern Europe to North America that was happening, particularly people of Slavic origin, Russians, Eastern Europeans, Ukrainians, Hungarians, those types of folks, folks who were Polish, and of a Polish background were coming to the country, as well as Italians, and folks from Southern Europe, like the Greeks, right? those folks were coming to America. They were coming to America in bucketfuls. And I've been to Ellis Island before. And actually, I shouldn't say bucketfuls, shipfuls. And they were showing up. They were being deloused. They were being given Americanized names. And they were being sent to boroughs in New York City, or sent west to work in places like Kansas and Missouri and Wisconsin and Nebraska. We read a little bit about this last year when we covered My Antonia. That was episode number 84 by Willa Cather, where she talked about immigration from those foreign countries and how that impacted people in Nebraska, people who were Americans. So when Roosevelt talks about Americanization, he's talking about people shedding their Eastern Europeanness to become white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, to become WASPs, right? And that's why he was surprised by the German, but he was also surprised by the Irish. Now, the thing with Irish folks, and there are Irish Protestants as well as Irish Catholics, the big concern in the late 19th century historically in America was the presence of Catholicism, and the idea among the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority in the United States at the time that anyone Catholic was going to be more loyal to the Pope than they were going to be loyal to the Constitution. See, this was back when religion actually mattered and when people actually had a religious mindset. It didn't mean they were moral. It didn't mean that they did not sin. It did not mean that they did not make mistakes or have opinions that we would find to be disgusting or just hard to hear. What it meant was they had a religious framework to put those opinions into. And it was a religious framework that was given to them by the Protestant Church and, of course, by the Catholic Church. And there were a lot of Catholics in New York State at the time. New York State now, irony upon ironies, is now one of the least religious states in the Northeast and one of the, I believe, the top 5 or top 10 least religious states in the United States. Where did all the Catholics and Protestants go that were once in New York City? Well, they all emigrated to other places, or they were, well, and I hate to frame it this way, but they were pushed out of their boroughs, right? They abandoned their religion after World War II and raised subsequent generations to be a-religious and rely on the WASP culture to do the work that family and the church used to do. So this is why Teddy Roosevelt was surprised that the Irish guy, whom he thought would be more akin to what the Pope wanted, was really akin to what Roosevelt wanted as a member of the WASP aristocracy. These dynamics are still playing out today in America. That's why I'm bringing this up. Look, if you are listening to this and you were born anywhere between 1984 and 1997, or if you were born between 1997 and 2017, I want you to listen very, very closely. Nothing that you are seeing anywhere on social media around politics is new. None of the racial division is new. None of the political division is new. The thing that is different is we don't have religious language to encapsulate how we talk about this division, and we need to get that back into our body politic, I think. But we do think of politics religiously. We do think of politics in the same way that Theodore Roosevelt did. It's just that we don't like to say it out loud. Or I should say, those who are on the left and the right of political factions in the United States like to talk about nothing but politics. But they talk about it in the language not of solving problems, which is what frustrates many of you, but they talk about it in the fervent language of religion, which means there's always an existential crisis and there's never a transcendent solution. Theodore Roosevelt is doing something different in Essays on Practical Politics. That's why it's called Essays on Practical Politics. Key term there is practical. What are we actually doing? What's the actual outcome of our character? And that's why he starts off with character. That's why he talks about who these people are and how they have become Americanized. Because back in the day, the solution to the character problem was that everybody needed to be or needed to adopt white Anglo-Saxon Protestant mores. Do we advocate for that now? Well, no, we don't. Now, in America, in 2024, I think Theodore Roosevelt would be shocked at how much of a melting pot we have. But he would not be shocked that even in that melting pot, a person of Hispanic descent, a person of African-American descent, a person who is a lesbian, a person who identifies as being gay, a person who identifies as being, a vegan, a person who identifies in any of these other spaces where we put identity these days is still behaving with their character in the exact same way that the legislatures and the legislators were behaving with their character in 1883. There are no new things under the sun. And the practical nature of people and the practical motivations of people should not be masked by calls or appeals to their identity. Instead, we should look through those surface things. This is a practical solution to this problem. We should look past the surface appeals and begin to look more closely and to examine more critically people's hearts and motives. All right, back to the book, back to Essays on Practical Politics. We're going to pick up a little bit further down, and we're going to address, in parallel to this idea of character in the state legislature, we're going to talk about incidents of legislative experience. We're going to see how the shenanigans of the past seem to have an echo in the shenanigans of the present. From Essays on Practical Politics by Theodore Roosevelt. A mixture of classical and constitutional misinformation was displayed a few sessions past in the state Senate before I was myself a member of the legislature. It was on the occasion of that annual nuisance, the debate upon the Catholic protectory item of the supply bill. Every year, someone who is desirous of bidding for the Catholic vote introduces this bill, which appropriates a sum of varying dimensions for the support of the Catholic protectory, an excellent institution, but one which has no right whatever to come to the state for support. Each year, the insertion of the item is opposed by a small number of men, including the more liberal Catholics themselves, on proper grounds, and by a larger number from simple bigotry, a fact which was shown 2 years ago, when many of the most bitter opponents of this measure cheerfully supported a similar and equally objectionable one in aid of a Protestant institution. On the occasion referred to, there were 2 senators, both Celtic gentlemen, who were rivals for the leadership of the minority. One of them a stout, red-faced little man who went by the name of Commodore, owing to his having seen service in the Navy, while the other was a dapper, voluble fellow who had at one time been on a civic commission and was always called the counselor. A mild-mannered countryman was opposing the insertion of the item on the ground, perfectly just, by the way, that it was unconstitutional, and he dwelt upon this objection at some length. The counselor, who knew nothing of the Constitution, except that it was continually being quoted against all of his favorite projects, fidgeted about for some time, and at last jumped up to know if he might ask the gentleman a question. The latter said yes, and the counselor went on, "I'd like to know if the gentleman has ever personally seen the Catholic protectory." "No, I haven't," said the astonished countryman. "Then what do you mean by talking about it being unconstitutional, I'd like to know? It's no more unconstitutional than you are, not one bit. I know it, for I've been in and seen it, and that's more than you've done." Then turning to the House with a slow and withering sarcasm, he added, "The trouble with the gentleman is that he occupies what lawyers would call a kind of quasi-position upon this bill," and sat down amid the applause of his followers. His rival, the Commodore, felt he had gained altogether too much glory from the encounter, and after the nonplussed countryman had taken his seat, he stalked solemnly over to the desk of the elated counselor, looked at him majestically for a moment, and said, "You'll excuse my mentioning, sir, that the gentleman who has just sat down knows more law in a week than you do in a month. And more than that, Counselor Shaughnessy, what do you mean by quoting Latin on the floor of this house when you don't know the alpha and the omega of the language?" And back he walked, leaving the counselor in humiliated submission behind him. Pause for just a moment. I don't think that there's anything better that anyone's doing on Instagram than that entire interaction right there. Back to the book. The counselor was always falling foul of the Constitution. Once, when defending one of his bills, which made a small but wholly indefinable appropriation of state money for a private purpose, he asserted that the Constitution didn't touch little things like that. And on another occasion, he remarked in my presence that he never allowed the Constitution to come between friends. The Commodore was at that time chairman of a Senate committee before which there sometimes came questions affecting the interests or supposed interests of labor. The committee was hopelessly bad in its composition, the members being either very corrupt or exceedingly inefficient. The Commodore generally kept order with a good deal of dignity. Indeed, when as not infrequently happened, he had looked upon the rye that was flavored with lemon peel, his sense of personal dignity grew till it became fairly majestic, and he ruled the committee with a rod of iron. By the way, pause. When Roosevelt says, and I quote, he had looked upon the rye that was flavored with lemon peel, what he means is the man had been drinking rye whiskey with lemon. Back to the book. At one time, a bill had been introduced, one of the several score of preposterous measures that annually made their appearance purely for purposes of buncombe, by whose terms all laborers in the public works of great cities were to receive $3 a day, double the market price of labor. To this bill, by the way, an amendment was afterwards offered in the House by some gentleman with a sense of humor, which was to make it read that all the inhabitants of great cities were to receive $3 a day, and the privilege of laboring on the public works if they chose. The original author of the bill questioning doubtfully if the amendment didn't make the measure a trifle too sweeping. The measure was, of course, of no consequence whatever to the genuine laboring men, but was of interest to the professional labor agitators, and a body of the latter requested to leave to appear before the committee. This was granted, but on the appointed day, the chairman turned up in a condition of such portentous dignity as to make it evident that he had been out on a spree of protracted duration. Down he sat at the head of the table and glared at the committeemen, while the latter, whose faces would not have looked amiss in a rogue's gallery, cowered before him. The first speaker was a typical professionally laboring man, a sleek, oily little fellow with a black mustache who had never done a stroke of work in his life. He felt confident that the Commodore would favor him, a confidence soon to be rudely shaken, and began with a deprecatory smile. "Humble though I am," rap, rap, rap with the chairman's gavel, and the following dialogue occurred. Chairman with dignity: "What's that you said you were, sir?" Professional working man, decidedly taken aback: I said I was humble, sir." Chairman reproachfully: "Are you an American citizen?" Professional working man: "Yes, sir." Chairman with emphasis: "Then you're the equal of any man in this state. Then you're the equal of any man on this committee. Don't let me hear you call yourself humble again. Go on, sir." After this warning, the advocate managed to keep clear of the rocks until, having worked himself up to quite a pitch of excitement, he incautiously exclaimed, "But the poor man has no friends," which brought the Commodore down on him at once. Rap, rap, rap went his gavel, and he scowled grimly at the offender, while he asked with deadly deliberation, "What did you say that time, sir?" Professional working man, hopelessly: "I said the poor man had no friends, sir." Chairman with sudden fire: "Then you lied, sir. I am the poor man's friend. So are my colleagues, sir." Here the rogue's gallery tried to look benevolent. "Speak the truth, sir," with a sudden change from the matter admonitory to the matter mandatory. "Now you sit down quick, or get out of this somehow." This put an end to the sleek gentleman, and his place was taken by a fellow professional of another type, a great burly man who would talk to you on private matters in a perfectly natural tone of voice, but who, the minute he began to speak of the wrongs, with a capital W, of labor, with a capital L, bellowed it as if he had been a bull of Bashan. The Commodore, by this time pretty far gone, eyed him malevolently, swaying to and fro in his chair. However, the first effect of the fellow's oratory was soothing rather than otherwise, and produced the unexpected result of sending the chairman fast asleep, sitting bolt upright. But in a minute or two, as the man warmed up to his work, he gave a peculiarly resonant howl, which waked the Commodore up. The latter came to himself with a jerk, looked fixedly at the audience, having caught sight of the speaker, remembered having seen him before, forgot that he had been asleep, and concluded that it must have been on some previous day. Hammer, hammer, hammer went the gavel, and, "I've seen you before, sir?" "You have not," said the man. "Don't tell me I lie, sir," responded the Commodore with a sudden ferocity. "You've addressed this committee on a previous day." "I've never," began the man, but the Commodore broke in again. "Sit down, sir. The dignity of the chair must be preserved. No man shall speak to this committee twice. The committee stands adjourned." And with that, he stalked majestically out of the room, leaving the committee and the delegation to gaze sheepishly into each other's faces. The late, great political commentator, radio political commentator, Rush Limbaugh. I think I've been far enough away now from his passing a few years ago to be able to quote this to you. He used to say on his show that, and it is a clever sort of framing for what we just read there, he used to say, politics is celebrity for the ugly. And he wasn't wrong. Ugly in behavior, ugly in character, or just even ugly in person. But he was really focused on how, politicians like to hobnob with actresses and models. And of course, we see that even in our day. But an interesting twist has occurred in the last 25 years or so, and of course it has speeded up in the last 10 to 15 years with the ubiquitousness of social media. Now we have politicians who are beautiful, or who could maybe be on the cover of a magazine, or maybe are attractive enough to have their own show on the radio, or maybe even on the television. And you have these people running around doing politics and becoming celebrities and being beautiful. Lauren Boebert is attractive. Marjorie Taylor Greene is not hard on the eyes. Rashid Tlaib is not ugly. Dan Crenshaw is not hideous. And of course, Tulsi Gabbard looks like she walked off of the cover of Vanity Fair. The politicians of the past were less concerned with their physical appearance and more concerned with getting stuff done. Or at least that's what we believe, right? We believe that they were more concerned with getting stuff done. But you think about that clip, right? That piece that I read there from Teddy Roosevelt's own observation of politicians in Albany in 1883, 1884, and in 1885. And what you realize is they were no more concerned with getting things done back then than they are concerned with getting things done now. Politics is not about getting stuff done. Politics for politicians is about having power. It's about being able to bang the gavel, talk over people, get special favors, tell people what you want them to do, and have the power to make laws, which are basically just force on paper, to make laws so that the thing that you want to have happen, or the interests that you have to serve, gets whatever it is that you promised them. The dirty little secret of politics in America, particularly politics in Washington, D.C., and all the politicians that I mentioned are in Washington, D.C., but you can find the same politicians in your local legislature or even in your state legislature. You can find the same people running for political position in your local city council or on your school board or running for mayor. In general, what happens is people are more effective the closer they are to the voters as politicians, and they are less effective the further away they are as politicians from the people. I like Tulsi Gabbard and everything, and Dan Crenshaw seems like a cool guy, but he's never going to know who I am, and she's not going to care what I think about anything. Which is why many of these politicians are going to not are going to, but are consumed with creating Instagram accounts, and they are consumed with becoming celebrities. In the same way that star athletes who used to be consumed with winning games now are more consumed with what their Instagram followers or their TikTok views are. That's a major shift, right? I mean, Andy Warhol, not Quentin Tarantino. Andy Warhol infamously said back in the day, and I think Tarantino would probably agree with him, that everyone at some point will have their own 15 minutes of fame. And you could even say that I'm doing the podcast to get my own 15 minutes of fame, right? What are our motives for doing what we do? What are our motives for being in politics? What are your motives for having an Instagram account? What are your motives for running for political office? Are you running to actually change things, or are you running for personal aggrandizement? Are you running so that you can bang a gavel and talk over people? The example that I think of is the late great Gary Shandling, right? Who portrayed a senator in Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 2, and I believe he was also in Iron Man 3. And he put a medal on Tony Stark after a particularly contentious senatorial hearing. And he whispered to him, "Isn't it annoying," and I'm paraphrasing, but isn't it annoying what a little prick can do to you? Now, I personally think Gary Shandling was a fairly funny comedian. And of course, he looks like a United States senator. He was ugly. He was never physically appealing, and he knew it. And by the way, that was part of the joke. But the point is, what are your motives for doing what you're doing? What are your motives for attaining fame? What do you want to do with that thing once you get it? We don't ask our politicians this nearly often enough, and very often because we do not ask, we don't get an answer. And by the way, the people who do ask, what are you going to do with that power, typically tend to be people with money who want something to happen that benefits them. They want to provide the answer to the politician for what they will do with the power. And typically the answer is, well, I'll do what benefits the person who gives me the most money. If you're okay with that, then keep on not paying attention to politics. Keep on thinking that it doesn't matter. Keep on thinking that that's something for smarter people someplace else over there. And by the way, Teddy Roosevelt makes that point as well in his essays on practical politics. It is up to the electorate to hold the legislators' feet to the fire. It is up to us to mold our guardians into whatever mold we want them to be in. And it is up to us to keep them honest. But if we're not smart enough or courageous enough or tactful enough or aware of parliamentary procedure enough to be able to do that, or if we just don't care and just want the system to quote-unquote work, well, then we're going to get people who want celebrity and money and power, but not much else. Back to the book, back to Essays on Practical Politics by Theodore Roosevelt. So we're going to turn a corner here as we approach the close of our podcast today. And we're going to talk about the machine and machine politics, not only in New York City in 1883, but we're going to make some points about machine politics, or Roosevelt's going to make some points about machine politics that resonate down to our time. And I quote, "In New York City, as in most of our other great municipalities, the direction of political affairs has been for many years mainly in the hands of a class of men who make politics their regular business and means of livelihood. These men are able to keep their grip only by means of the singularly perfect way in which they have succeeded in organizing their respective parties and factions, and it is in consequence of the clockwork regularity and efficiency with which these several organizations play their parts, alike for good and evil, that they have been nicknamed by outsiders machines, while the men who take part in and control, or as they would themselves say, run them, form now a well-recognized and fairly well-defined class in the community, and are familiarly known as machine politicians. It may be of interest to sketch and outline some of the characteristics of these men and of their machines, the methods by which and the objects for which they work, and the reasons for their success in the political field. The men having control and doing all the work have gradually come to have the same feeling about politics. These are the machine men that are running the machine, that other men have about the business of a merchant or a manufacturer. It was too much to expect that if left entirely to themselves, they would continue disinterestedly to work for the benefit of others. Many a machine politician who is today a most unwholesome influence on our politics is in private life quite as respectable as anyone else. Only he has forgotten that his business affects the state at large, and regarding it as merely his own private concern, he has carried into it the same selfish spirit that actuates the majority of the mercantile community. Our machine politicians in actual life act in just this same way. Their actions are almost always dictated by selfish motives. With but little regard for the people at large, they therefore need continually to be watched and opposed by those who wish to see good government." And then Roosevelt describes the causes of machine politics here, and I quote, "The chief causes thus operating against good government are the moral and mental attitudes towards politics assumed by different sections of the voters. There is a great class of laboring men, mostly of foreign birth or parentage, who at present both expect too much from legislation and yet at the same time realize too little how powerfully, though indirectly, they are affected by a bad or corrupt government. In many wards, the overwhelming majority of the voters do not realize that heavy taxes fall ultimately upon them and actually view with perfect complacency burdens laid by their representatives upon the taxpayers and, if anything, approve of a hostile attitude towards the latter, having a vague feeling of hostility towards them as possessing more than their proper proportion of the world's good things, and sharing with most other human beings the capacity to bear with philosophic equanimity ills merely affecting one's neighbors. When powerfully roused on some financial, but still more on some sentimental question, this same laboring class will throw its enormous and usually decisive weight into the scale which it believes inclines to the right. But its members are often curiously and cynically indifferent to charges of corruption against favorite heroes or demagogues, so long as these charges do not imply betrayal of their own real or fancied interests. These voters are, moreover, very emotional. They value in a public man what we are accustomed to consider virtues only to be taken into account when estimating private character. I have more than once heard the statement, "He is very liberal to the poor," advanced as a perfectly satisfactory answer to the charge that a certain public man was corrupt. These working men are hardly prepared to understand or approve the American doctrine of government, which is that the state has no business whatever to attempt to better the condition of a man or set of men, but has merely to see that no wrong is done him or them by anyone else, and that all alike are to have a fair chance in the struggle for life, a struggle wherein it may as well at once be freely thought, be freely though sadly acknowledged. Very many are bound to fail, no matter how ideally perfect any given system of government may be. There's an idea that was stated in Game of Thrones way back in the day. If you remember that show, you remember the ones with the dragons and looked like medieval times. And there was a blonde woman running around in it, and she had an 800-ton dragon. Remember that? Yeah. Well, the blonde woman told the short guy, the midget, or I'm sorry, it's not midget, it's small person. The small person in the show, played by Peter Dinklage. And for if any of you hear this and you know Peter, please beg my forgiveness. But anyway, they were talking, and the blonde lady made a point. Emilia Clarke, I believe, is the actress's name. Anyway, playing Daenerys Targaryen, and she made a point. She said, and I quote, "Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell, they're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on and on and on it spins, crushing those on the ground." And then Tyrion Lannister, played by Peter Dinklage, says to her, "It's a beautiful dream, stopping the wheel. You're not the first person who's ever dreamt it." And then Daenerys, the blonde lady, responds, "I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel." There are many people in our time, in 2024, but starting probably about 20 years ago, maybe even 30 now, who have a sincere and overwhelming desire to break the machine of politics. This goes along with our nihilistic and self-centered, in some cases, and narcissistic, in many cases, approach to problem solving. It also goes to, specifically in American context, our frustration with things that take too long. For we are an impatient people, and we like to get up after it, be done with it, and then get up after something else. What Roosevelt was talking about in his section there on the nature of the men who run the machine of politics in 1883 New York, and the nature of the voters, specifically the laboring class, the working men as he called them, who vote for the politicians that are supported by this machine, the point that Roosevelt was making is that all of this is symbiotic, as was in his time, such as it is in ours. See, in our time, the machine of politics still runs, and particularly in America, with only two parties, though you can see this in parliamentary systems, the machine of politics is not just about Republican and Democrat, okay? The machine of politics isn't about the people that you see on the billboards or on your television campaign commercials. I could name names, but it doesn't really matter. The people behind the machine, the people who give the money, the people who donate, those are the people who put money in the machine. And money is the mother's milk of politics. It is also the gas in the car. This is how consultants, whether or not their candidates lose, still get paid. People were confused by this. Voters are confused by this because they believe that they're voting for the man or the woman who is on the ballot. And what they don't realize is they're voting for the machine that put the man or the woman on the ballot. And the machine is run by men whose interests do not align with theirs. Over the last 4 years in America, there has been a growing understanding of the nature of the machine behind the politician, the nature and the thought process of the billionaires behind our politics. Now, on both the Republican and Democrat side, there are these billionaires. There are people who made their money in hedge funds, and there are people who made their money selling widgets. But both of them would like to see the machine work for them, and the average voter, well, they can be damned. But the average voter now has access to the internet, and now has access to social media, and now has access to Google and research. The average voter now has access to more data and information than the average working man did in Theodore Roosevelt's time. And what they're doing with that information is they are using it to break the machine. By the way, the candidates that come out of those attempts to break the machine. The Ramaswamis, the Sanderses, the Trumps, at least in American politics, the candidates, the people that come out of that machine typically are fed by the dollars of average people. If you don't believe me, I once read a story in the Wall Street Journal. This has to have been probably about 6 months ago, maybe 8, about how on the Republican Party, the vast majority of the donations going not to the candidates that you see on the Wall Street Journal or in the Washington Post, but the candidates whose names you see in your local elections, the vast majority of those dollars, well over 50%, were coming from people who were donating $100 or less. Small donors have power now. And the machine that was once run by billionaires, and they are still there, don't get me wrong, is gradually being eroded in America. And it is being replaced, and this is a solution to a problem, it is being replaced by a machine that is infinitely more populist, both on the left and on the political right. This, of course, causes consternation, because when small things come along that upend and disrupt large things, like small media coming along and upending large media, or small donors coming in and upending larger donors, chaos reigns, which is what we've had in American politics for at least the last 4 presidential election cycles. That chaos isn't going anywhere because we're working something out fundamentally. We're working out the breaking of the machine and the remaking of it into something, well, something that represents the actual working man voter. The working man voter whose life might have tragic consequences. Case in point, I recently saw a picture of a person who was photographed getting ready to go and vote, and this person was in a wheelchair, clearly unable to walk, clearly sickly, and this person had their hands together and was bowed in prayer. A person living a tragic life, or maybe their life is fine. Maybe it was just a snapshot in time. But understanding that life is tragic, and understanding that it cannot be made fair by any form of government, and that even the best governments attempt to smooth the path somewhat, I think that is something that is understood and appreciated by people who make thousands of dollars a year, more so than people who scrape the top or skim the top off of a hedge fund to the tune of billions of dollars a year. The people who are much closer to the tragedies of life will probably build a more populous machine. Will it be a better one? Well, Teddy Roosevelt and I would probably agree on this. We cannot say whether it will be good or bad, whether it will be better or worse, but we can say that it will still, at the end of the day, be a machine. All right, well, time to turn the corner. Talk a little bit about staying on the path here. So how do we leverage insights from Teddy Roosevelt's essays on practical politics? And, of course, tying that into what we read in Republic of Plato in episode number 90 with Tom Libby. And we're going to be following up this episode with our next episode, where we're going to be talking with Libby Unger about Woodrow Wilson's treatise when a man comes to himself. So, what do these three things have in common? What do these three sort of ideas have in common? What are we trying to explore here at the beginning of the year here on the podcast? Well, a couple of different things. Remember I said we're going to talk about solutions to problems more so on this podcast this year rather than constantly talking about just the problems themselves. And the biggest problem that Essays on Practical Politics reveals, and it is a problem that continues on down to our time, is that we don't like the things our leaders do. Very rarely do you find someone who actually likes something that a leader does. And by the way, this could be a leader in a small business. This could be a leader in a community. This could be a leader in politics. And Abraham Lincoln notoriously said, you can only make some of the people happy some of the time, right? Steve Jobs once quipped that if you want to make everyone happy, hand out ice cream, right? Being a leader is inherently about making some people unhappy. And sometimes those people are a large minority. Sometimes it's 49% of the people who are unhappy and 51% of the people who are cheering you and have your back. Well, when we don't like what our leaders do, what are the functions for us as a people in America to get rid of those people? Well, Theodore Roosevelt would say the function is politics. The function is the election cycle. The function is keeping a thumb on the administration and on the bureaucrats. And by the way, that whole system was smaller in his time. But the thing that you have to keep in mind is that even during his time, the administrative bureaucracy was thought to be too large. We look back on it and we go, my gosh, wouldn't it have been amazing to live back then if you really love freedom or if you really love open spaces and exploration. You could do anything back then in a way that you can't do it now. Well, from the perspective of people back then, there was too much government. The same perspective that we have now. If we don't like the things our leaders do, we need to tell them. That's the solution. There are so many outlets to do that these days, and we are telling them. We are yelling at them. We are exploring those outlets. The internet and social media has, of course, exploded the ability to directly touch, and I don't mean with our hands, but directly impact the nature of legislation that occurs not necessarily in D.C., but in our own state capitals, in our own towns, in our own backyards. And then, of course, go vote, right? Go get engaged. Go sit in a caucus. Go figure out how votes are counted. Myself, I used to volunteer to be an election observer. I did that for many, many years while I lived in another state than the one that I currently live in now. And so observing elections gave me insight into the on-the-ground election process. What's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, and where the angles are. Get involved. Tell your leaders that you don't like the things they're doing. The second problem that faces us is that they don't listen to us when we tell them that we don't like what they're doing. And the reason why they don't listen to us is because we're approaching very often the problem wrong, or we're approaching it from an ego-driven perspective. Roosevelt actually has a piece in here that I didn't read in his Essays on Practical Politics about all the letters that he received from various members of his constituency when he was in Albany. And, he amusedly sort of defines these letters and defines these missives and these communications as coming from people who are outsiders, right? And, he describes that the number of men who persist, I'm going to quote directly from this, the number of men who persist in writing one letters of praise, abuse, and advice on every conceivable subject is appalling, and the writers are of every grade, from the lunatic and the criminal up. The most difficult to deal with are men with hobbies. There is the Protestant fool who thinks that our liberties are menaced by the machinations of the Church of Rome, and his companion idiot who wants legislation against all secret societies, especially the Masons. Then there are the believers in isms, of whom the women suffragists stand out in the first rank. Now, to the horror of my relatives, I have always been a believer in women's rights, but I must confess I have never seen such a hopelessly impracticable set of persons as the women suffragists who came up to Albany to get legislation. They simply would not draw up their measures in proper form. and on and on and on. If you want to get the attention of someone who's in politics, someone who is a political leader, even in your town, you need to approach them correctly. If you don't like that they don't listen to you and do what they want, what you want them to do, develop an interest in parliamentary politics and develop an interest in the nature of elections. Yeah. It's sexy once every 4 years, right? To talk about who's at the top of a particular ticket. It's less sexy to do the work 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 years beforehand to get that person to the top of a ticket. And it all starts in your own backyard. Finally, the last objection, the last problem that Roosevelt offers us a solution for in his essays on practical politics is this one. I don't have time to track all of this down. Well, hey, son, I don't have the time to pay attention to politics. Hey, son, I don't have time to pay attention to all the nonsense going on. I vote for these people once every couple of years or once every 4 years. Isn't that enough? Why do I have to know parliamentary politics? Why do I have to know about the nature of elections? Why do I have to know the policies? Why do I have to know who the donors are? Why do I have to know all this stuff? I pay those people to be experts to know all that stuff so that I can go off and do the stuff that I'm an expert in. They're not coming down and learning about my job. To wit, I say this. You're correct. They don't come down to you and learn your job. But you do go up to them and tell them how to do their job all of the time. One of the simplest ways to battle the I don't have time to track all of this down idea is to listen to more podcasts like this one. And there's several other ones that are out in the market today that can inform you. I would normally say listen to radio and read at least a couple of journals that are good public policy journals, but reading has gone by the wayside, as I know. That's why I host this. That's why I host this podcast. But listen to this podcast. Listen to others like it, where you can break down ideas into smaller chunks that are understandable. But at an even more practical level, stop watching Netflix. Stop doom scrolling through Instagram and Facebook. Put away the dopamine high of whatever social media platform you particularly care for. And pick up some interest, pick up some caring in your local political interests. I don't know if you know this, but in most local school board elections, less than 2% of the available voters vote in a local school board election. That means in an average town of 10,000 people, less than 100 vote in an election for school board. And yet those are the people on that school board that are determining what kind of education children in the schools get. And those children in the schools become adults. And those adults can become your coworkers, and some of them will become your boss or your manager or your leader. Might be a really good idea to show up for the school board elections. They actually may matter more than who sits in the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. Just some things to think about and to take as solutions to problems that we have during an election year, 2024, and in all future election years where you will be listening to this, as we listen and as we read essays on practical politics by Theodore Roosevelt. And well, that's it for me. Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. If you're listening to this on any of the major podcast players, like iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, please go ahead and leave us a 5-star review and write a little bit in there. A couple of sentences is good enough. That actually helps us game those algorithms that I was just maybe addressing. And, of course, it helps us grow the show. Tell all your family, tell all your friends, and tell the leaders in your life that you know that need to be listening to this show, that this show exists. By the way, if you want to get started on the leadership path yourself, or you know some people who need to go on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing, the home company of Leadership Toolbox and Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, can help you and your team do that. So check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We are remote, we're live, we're in person, we're on video, and we've got leadership development solutions for your civic group, nonprofit staff, public sector staff, or even your private sector leaders. And of course, you're going to want to check out our video-based subscription service at leadingkeys.com. That's leadingkeys.com for leadership development on demand. You don't like videos, you don't like training, but you really like the podcast? Well, I would also recommend reading a book. Matter of fact, I'd recommend reading my most recent book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. You can get that in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Ingram Spark, and any other place that you order books online. Finally, of course, we're on YouTube just like everybody else is. We'd love to have you help us grow the YouTube channel, so like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing, or you can search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button. Subscribing helps us grow the show. As it does with the audio, just is the same with the video. All right, that's it for me.